Appreciate the invitation, particularly on this topic, as it's it's one that has really driven my research interests for about a decade now, but certainly my practice and my life for as long as I can remember. Before we get into the talk, it's important that I do a couple of things because part of the talk is a pretty significant part of the talk is going to dive into some of the clinical work that has emerged to really give kind of a mainstream standing to what we've known culturally from the beginning of our ancestors. And so I want to start with some of that acknowledgement. So I come from the Opata people, and in our traditions, you don't come and speak on someone else's land just because you get an invitation from an institution like UC Berkeley. In fact, that could be the very reason you shouldn't go. And I'm a UC Berkeley grad saying that. And in our tradition, when you come to speak on someone else's land, the first thing that you have to do is acknowledge that you're on somebody else's land. Okay, so I just want to begin by acknowledging that this is indigenous land. And in our traditions, in order to speak on another indigenous group's land, you have to ask for permission. So I start by asking permission from the indigenous people of this land to share palabra with you today. And then given that permission, then you have to ask permission from your own ancestors. Because I come from the 7 generations principle, which believes that everything that I do, say, experience today is actually an echoing forward of 7 generations of my ancestors. And that I'm a vehicle and a vessel for representing the best of those 7 generations of my people. And we also acknowledge that the 7 generations principle works in both directions. So it's 7 generations coming forward for us right now, but also understanding our significance as human beings. Our sacred purpose on this planet acknowledges that everything that we do in any given moment will echo forward 7 generations. And that's how important you are. That's how important the healing work that you do every day with young people is. It's not just about that young person. Literally, the healing that you do, the love, the care that you extend to the people in your lives echoes forward for 7 generations. It transcends your body and your time on this planet. And so we ask permission both from our ancestors and then also from all the generations that are yet to come to share palabra with you today. So given that request, I've been asked to share some of the work that a whole group of us have been doing for quite some time, specifically in Oakland, but there's obviously a growing conversation about what it means to be truly culturally and community responsive to the lives of young people who institutions in this country have at best ignored and at worst have added to the trauma and the harm that's being done to those young people. And so the talk that I'm going to do today is actually based on a piece that I wrote for the Harvard Ed Review a few years back. So if there's citations that come up, research that I refer to that you find particularly useful for your work, you can look up the article. That's actually the title of the article. You can Google search that title and or my name and almost certainly pull up a copy of it on the Google. If for any reason you can't, feel free to email me and I'll be happy to violate my publishing contract with Harvard and send it to you. So I'm the youngest of 7 kids. And as the youngest, I often felt like it was my birthright to complain about pretty much everything. And I remember one time I came in the house and I was ranting and raving about something, and my mom stops me in the middle of my rant. She points at the kitchen table and she says, "Sit down." And she goes in the kitchen and she takes a glass and she fills it halfway with water, and she comes back and she sits down and she puts the glass between us. And she says, "Half full or half empty?" And my mom's was good for those kind of trick questions where there is no right answer, so whatever answer you give is the wrong answer, and that's the lesson that you need right now. So I just stared back blankly. I didn't take the bait on this occasion. And she says, son, how you choose to answer that question is how you will live your life. Because your life will always be both half full and half empty. And if you choose to see your life as half empty, if you choose to see your life for all the things that you don't have, you'll never fill your cup. But if you can see your life as half full, if you can see your life for the things that you do have, you will fill your cup, it will overflow, and you can share that with others. Now, this is precisely what I think that Tupac Shakur means when he talks about young people growing up in poverty as the roses that grow from concrete. Now, you can come down anywhere you want on Pac. Cornel West says, no one free of spot or wrinkle, right? And I agree. I think Tupac deserves to be critiqued for some of the things that he did and some of the things that he said and some of the ways that he lived his life. But who doesn't? Right? What is undeniable to me as a 24-year classroom educator in East Oakland, as a community member from the 3400 block of East Oakland, as a father raising 2 brown boys on that block, and as a researcher, I challenge you to find anyone in late modernity that has had the reach to teach that Tupac Shakur has had. And I mean crossing all the lines that we say we want to cross as educators: race, class, gender, political boundaries. I mean, I'm working in elementary school now, and those kids are still listening to Pac. And I've been a high school teacher for 2 decades, and those kids are still listening to Pac. Pac was murdered in '96. Truth be told, some of y'all drove in today listening to Pac. Right? And it's not hip-hop. Okay, that's so dismissive to say, oh, you know, it's rap. First of all, it's not rap. Okay, rap and hip-hop, not the same thing. That's another conference. Okay. But it's not hip-hop, because if it was hip-hop, then young people would still be listening to Public Enemy. They'd still be listening to Wu-Tang. They'd still be listening to Chris. Okay? And they're not. Okay? The hip-hop heads are. But I'm talking about the most disconnected youth are not listening to those folks anymore, but they're still listening to Pac. Okay? About 12 years ago, I was invited to New Zealand to start doing some work with the Maori community in New Zealand. And for those of you that are not familiar with the indigenous politic of the globe, the Maori are the indigenous people of New Zealand. And so my first meeting, you know, I told you I'm from the 3400 block. If we had a map of the world right behind me, and I put a pin on my block, the 3400 block of East Oakland, and then I put a pin in Otere, which is the city just outside of Auckland in New Zealand, where I was working with Maori schools. It's literally the other side of the world. Okay, so I'm not being hyperbolic here when I say I was on the other side of the world. And my first meeting was with a group of about 30 high school Maori youth. And I walk in the room, and they're all sitting in a circle, and this one young brother hops up, and he runs up to me. He says, "You're from Oakland?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he says, "Did you know Tupac?" And it was just so deep to me that I'm literally on the other side of the world. And the first question out of a young person's mouth is about Pac. Yeah, I can tell you as a veteran high school English teacher that I can take a crisp $100 bill, stick it inside any Shakespearean text, leave that text anywhere in my classroom, and it is completely safe. But if I take Pac's book of poetry, and I leave it anywhere in my room. And a lot of folks don't know that Pac wrote a book of poetry. That's actually the title of his book of poetry. It's also the title of probably the best-known poem in that book. If I leave that book of poetry out anywhere in my classroom, it is immediately snatched up. And it's often snatched up by the very same children that the system is convinced aren't interested in reading. Hey, I tell principals, I tell teachers, I tell superintendents, I told Arnie Duncan to his face that it's not that young people aren't interested in literacy. It's that they're not interested in the literacy we're giving them. Okay? And those are two fundamentally different ways to construct the challenge of recapturing the hearts of our most disconnected youth, our most wounded youth, right, are the ones that are the least likely to find school relevant to the material conditions of their lives. And in a pluralistic, multiracial democracy, that's antithetical to a pluralistic, multiracial democracy. That is the group of young people that this democracy can least afford to fail with, and yet it's the group that we consistently, historically, decades long have failed with, right? How do we unwrap that riddle And I think that there is some real insight in Pak's work for how to unwrap that riddle, right? And my goal is not to make my classroom edutainment at all, right? But there's something about Pak's message that as a researcher, as a community member, as a father, and as an educator, I wanted to understand, okay, what can we distill from that message that is so compelling to so many young people? And how do we make our classrooms and our schools just that compelling? Okay, so as a way to frame up that conversation, I'm going to play on these 1980s speakers. We're going to see how this goes. Pak actually reading this poem. So Tupac actually read this poem on multiple tracks. The one that's probably the best known is a song called Mama's Just a Little Girl. Okay, and at the end of that song, over the beat of that song, he reads this poem. So I'm going to play that for us now to kind of frame up the conversation I'd like to have. Now, Pak's point here is effectively the same point that my mother was making at the kitchen table that day. Right? What Pak points out is how absurd it would be if you and Naomi are walking down the street and you see a rose in the concrete and you turn to the homie like, a rose in the concrete. And the homie looks back at you and says, yeah, but what a shame, it has damaged petals. Of course it has damaged petals, fool, it's growing in concrete. We do this all the time with young people, don't we? We see them for their damaged petals instead of for their tenacity and their will to reach the sun. We see them as a glass half empty instead of as a glass half full. They are both. Okay? Every person in this room is both, a glass half empty and a glass half full. And every time you come across people in your work, in your daily life, that see you first as a glass half empty, for the things that you don't bring to the table, you clock watch on that person. You punch in and punch out. You're only there as long as you have to be. And then you got people in your life that see you first as a glass half full. See you first for your assets. See you first for your resilience. See you first for your tenacity and your will to reach the sun. And they don't ignore the fact that you're also half empty. They don't ignore the fact that you got stuff to work on. They don't ignore the fact that you've got damaged petals, but it's not their starting point with you. It's an asset-based model. Okay? And with those people, you don't clock watch. With those people, you put in extra hours that don't feel like extra hours. With those people, you come on Saturday to a church conference. Okay? And that's our choice as adults. We choose how we see the young people that come to us. And that choice has a massive impact on how that young person sees you and sees the institution. Okay? And to the degree that adults begin to own our responsibility to always frame the relationship as asset, okay, as value, okay, as contribution, then young people are much more likely to receive those spaces as places that they actually want to invest their time and their heart space in. Now, if we're going to do that well, okay, it's not just about receiving young people for all the beauty that they bring. It's also about growing them. Okay? And in order to grow them, we've got to understand what Pak calls the damaged petals. Now, of all the stuff I've read, okay, all the experts I've met with, all the lectures I've been to, nothing has more profoundly impacted my day-to-day practice in the classroom than this film series. Okay, it's a 6-part, it's now actually, I think they have 8 episodes now, but it is originally a 6-part film series by PBS called Unnatural Causes. It is the largest study in the history of research on the impact of inequality on wellness. Okay, so it is a global study of this question: is inequality making us sick? Short answer? Yes. Okay, we shouldn't need to explain that at this conference, but okay. Widely agreed upon across fields. social epidemiology, public health, neuroscience, child development, psychology, the medical field, all agree the biggest threat to health on the planet is inequality. So if you're going to if you're going to build a healthy school culture, a healthy classroom culture, a healthy community culture, a healthy program culture, at the top of your list has to be the eradication of all forms of inequality. No oppression Olympics. Okay, you can't say, well, we're eradicating white supremacy right now and ignore male supremacy. Right? You can't ignore you can't address male supremacy and then ignore hetero supremacy. You can't address hetero supremacy and then ignore class supremacy. All forms of inequality on the table all the time. All forms of inequality have to be treated as odious, unacceptable, okay, if you're going to build a culture of wellness. Okay? You can't just bite them off one at a time. Now, the research is clear about this. The practice, not so much. Okay, now I don't, some of you may work in East Oakland, but I'm not from where you're from. I'm from where I'm from. Okay? And so it's clear to me where it is that we need to start in my community. Right? But I can't tell you where you need to start in your community. I wouldn't presume to do that because I'm not from your community. So the first stage to really figuring out how do you prioritize these, because these are some heavy lifts. Okay? How do you prioritize them? And this is not a list of impact. All of these have the same impact, okay, when they're actually in play. Right? Biochemically, neurologically, spiritually, emotionally, right? They're all toxic. And the research is clear on all these. Right? So you don't need to debate this anymore with anybody. There is no debate in the medical field about whether or not these are toxic to the body and the brain, whether or not they actually kill you. There is no debate in those fields. The fact that we still debate this shit in schools is absurd to me, okay? Especially when schools are saying that they're research-based and data-driven. No, you're not. If you debate these, you're neither research-based nor data-driven. Because there is no debate in the research or the data about whether these are real and whether or not they're toxic to young people and the adults working in schools. Right? But in order for you to really get your work around this, you've got to become an ethnographer of the place where you serve. The best teachers that we've researched in the world, the best teachers I've ever been around as a practitioner, are first and foremost ethnographers of the communities they serve. Okay? And because they're ethnographers of the communities they serve, they know where to start. Okay? They know what the biggest threats are to wellness in the lives of the young people they serve. Now, in our community, it's pretty clear that one of the, if not the biggest threat, okay, in deep East Oakland is violence, okay, and specifically physical violence. In 2006, the San Francisco Chronicle called itself so concerned with homicide in our community, they started mapping it. And they said that we have the plague, which I find interesting because, as I told you, I live right about there. So if we really had the plague, guess what? Y'all would be in trouble right now. Because the plague's the ultimate non-discriminator, isn't it? It doesn't recognize race. It doesn't recognize class. It doesn't recognize gender. And it certainly doesn't recognize political boundaries. But those red lines that just popped up are the political boundaries of our city. And as you can see, our plague has been almost perfectly quarantined between the 580 and the 880 freeways, what we call the flatlands or the lower bottoms. And you don't have to be a topographical genius looking at this map to see the outlier. What is it? Piedmont. Now, what the hell is going on in Piedmont where they can just completely opt out of the plague? Just be like, nah, I'm cool. I don't want any pass. Right? Cornel West jokes that Disneyland brags nobody's ever died on their premises. He says somebody probably has. They just push them across the line to keep their record clean. Okay? And I think that's what happened right there. Right? That was almost certainly in Piedmont. They just gave one more to Oakland. Right? Over 5 years, we had 555 homicides. And then in 2009, the Chronicle gave up and the Oakland Tribune started mapping homicides. And now every year on the front page of the Trib, they publish the homicide map. The names, the faces, the places of everybody who was murdered in our city. Okay? These are 4 of the most recent maps, and as you can see, there's been almost no stemming of the tide. So I decided that I would update the homicide map. And I'm going to do that for 13 years, because that's how many years young people actually go to public school in our city. This is 9 years, y'all. This freshman is just showing up to my 9th grade English class. And you tell me, where can a young person live in our city where they did not personally witness homicide, if not multiple homicides? And yet, what's the conversation in school about? SBAC, test scores, college to career pathways, SAT, all of which matter. All of which matter. What a hypocrite I'd be standing up here saying that doesn't matter with a degree from UC Berkeley. Of course they matter. But the question is what is their proper place in this context? And how do we make them matter in this context? Right? Because in this context, if you lead out with SAT, if you lead out, aren't you serious about trying to go to the Ivy League? If you lead out with, aren't you serious about A through G? If you lead out with, aren't you serious about a college and career pathway? If you lead out with, aren't you serious about your homework? Then you ignore that this is the leading factor in so many lives of young people. And if we don't build the bridge between the homework and that reality, then the homework is by default irrelevant in that child's life. And that is a biological fact. And it doesn't have anything to do with the color of the kid's skin. If I brought that plague and landed it in Piedmont, guess what would happen to their test scores? Guess what would happen to their student engagement and their college going? Probably very little. You know why? Because they'd respond differently. They would resource the shit out of those kids to make sure that they got the support and the care that they needed so that they could get back to the business of school. And we actually have hard evidence of that. I'll give you one example. Columbine, Colorado. Because when the plague landed in Columbine, Colorado, what was the response? Back page news? The homicide map? Crisis. Point of fact, national crisis. Now, I've been partially trained in discourse analysis, and if you do some discourse analysis of the interviews that took place at Columbine, they're quite interesting. And that's one of the values of YouTube. You can actually go back and do that after this conference. You can go back and do a discourse analysis of all the public interviews done by CBS, NBC, CNN, even Fox was there. And interview after interview after interview, the exact same thing was said. Oh my goodness, how do you feel? What are you dealing with right now? And person after person after person said, quote, unquote, this isn't supposed to happen here. That is code. That is code. There is a second sentence that need not be stated because it is so widely accepted in this nation state that the lives of some children matter more than the lives of other children. And so the second sentence that is not stated is, it's supposed to happen there. And you know that's what they really thought because they didn't say, this isn't supposed to happen, punto. They added the here. We live in a state of equivalent social apartheid, where literally when you map out toxicity and trauma, it's clear that the lives of some children in this nation matter more than the lives of others. And as long as that is the case, structurally and in practice, then we cannot possibly claim to be a pluralistic, multiracial democracy. We can't. It's myth-making. Right? And if we know that, who else you think knows that? Kids. And so as long as schools continue that myth-making narrative that if you just work hard enough and if you just show up and if you just study and if you just participate and if you just act right, then everything will work out. This is why so many kids are walking off of urban campuses, because we lie. We don't tell the truth. And until schools become about truth and reconciliation, then the lies will continue to be normalized. okay? And the maps will continue to unfold in the same way. And I promise you, wherever you come from, wherever you're here from, you can draw this same map. And it may not be homicide, it may be homelessness, it may be joblessness, it may be food insecurity, hey, it may be any of the toxic stressors that are on that list, but the map looks the same everywhere we go in this country. And the cause of this, okay, or the impact of this, is trauma. Okay? And part of the problem with the conversation about PTSD is that it's mostly been focused on this dude, which is right because soldiers are particularly prone to PTSD. But what I don't want anybody in the room to do, and what I don't want anybody that you're working with to do, is excuse themselves from this conversation because you don't live in East Oakland, because you don't live in a high homicide community. That is not what the research on trauma says. The research on trauma does not say the way you get trauma is by witnessing physical violence. That's not what it says. Hey, and Jason made that point earlier. The way in which you get trauma is exposure to unrelenting toxic stress. Okay? Now, physical violence can be one of those right buttons, but so can housing instability, right? So can identity instability. So can food instability, okay? So any form, right, of instability in one's life consistently that adds stressors to your life can result in trauma. And the problem is that while we're focused in the trauma conversation and elevating our understanding of trauma, hey, we're mostly talking about this dude and we're mostly ignoring these brothers. These are my students. This is me on the camera, and this is us burying another one of my students. A 16-year-old stabbed more than a dozen times in the face with a screwdriver about 3 blocks from my house. And this is who buried him. And the next day we're back at school. And what's the conversation about? Test scores, homework, right? Business as usual. When everybody in the school knows that map. Okay? But we act as if it's not even real. We ask kids to check that maleta, that suitcase at the door and come in and just be open to learning. Okay? And biologically, neurologically, okay, that is not possible for any human being. It's not. And so by default, that means that practice is by definition dehumanizing. Okay? And we are creating the conditions of dehumanizing the most vulnerable, the most wounded children in our society, okay, under the auspices that we're creating opportunity for them. Under the auspices that we're committed to rigor. Because it just wouldn't be fair to not have academic rigor for you when we're so academically rigorous in Piedmont. When everybody knows that if this happened in Piedmont, there would be no questions about your chemistry homework. We'd go to the heart space. We'd heal the heart space first because everybody knows if the heart space ain't right, you ain't getting into the head space. But we keep banging on the head space with young people who we know have wounded hearts. Okay? And it makes no sense unless we see those young people as less than human. Okay? And then we rationalize it. A great starting point, okay? And I'm assuming many of you are here because you're already invested in understanding this work. But you're almost certainly working with colleagues who aren't, who don't get it, okay? Who don't even know where to start. Okay? This book is a great primer. Okay, Bruce Perry is considered the nation's leading expert on child trauma. And this book is a great resource for anybody who doesn't really understand how trauma operates in the body and how it actually manifests with children, okay, in day-to-day life. And the great thing about Perry's book is that every chapter is a case study of a young person or a group of young people that Bruce worked with that experienced all kinds of different forms of childhood trauma. And I promise you, if you work with young people and you read this book, you will see the youth that you serve. You will see them in the stories that he tells. And it will transform the way in which you see them. And that's the first step, is to seeing the way in which children are acting differently. As long as we categorize it as bad behavior, then we'll respond to check down that behavior. But when we understand it as a normal human reaction to what they're carrying, okay, then it totally changes the way in which you respond. You move from a space of sympathy to a place of empathy. Okay? The move is from sympathy to solidarity. Okay? Do you understand that the children that we serve, that their suffering is our suffering? And until we can make that connection, it's really hard to make an empathic connection. And so what we end up doing is treating the trauma, okay, instead of healing the trauma. Now, y'all work in different kinds of spaces, but for those of you that are working in kind of mainstream school or school-like spaces, I'm assuming that you are data-driven. Yes? How many school-based educators here? Okay, y'all data-driven? No? I don't know what school you work at. That's the national mode of operation. Everybody's data-driven. Okay? And you may not actually be data-driven, but you're saying you're data-driven. Okay? And I actually think that that's fantastic. I really honestly do. Okay? No sarcasm at all. I think we should be data-driven. Okay? I got here today because I know where this place is. But normally when I get to a place, right, I have to use Waze. So I put in data. Do I not? Okay? Called an address, which is data. And then it gets me to where I'm going. What happens if I put in the wrong address? I'm going to get somewhere, but I'm not going to get where I'm supposed to be going. Right? It's not about being data-driven. It's about being driven by the right data. And the problem is that we are data-driven. We're just driven by the wrong data. And so if you're looking at data and it's not getting you the outcomes you want with young people, then change the damn data you're looking at. Otherwise, you're going to keep ending up in the wrong place. And you can't blame Waze for taking you to the wrong address if you put the damn wrong address in. Right? It's not Waze's fault. It's the user's fault. Okay? And so I want you to be data-driven. I want schools to be data-driven. But I want us to really think about the data that we're using to drive us in the direction that we're going, because we're not ending up in the right place right now. Now here's some data for you. This is from the national data set on youth trauma. 1 in 3 urban youth display the symptoms of mild to severe PTSD. 1 in 3. When they compared that to the Pentagon's data for soldiers returning from live combat, what they found is that urban youth are actually twice as likely as soldiers returning from live combat to experience PTSD. If you worked in a setting where 100% of your clients, your students, your families, 100% were combat vets, what is the training you would want? You'd want trauma training. For sure, undeniably, top of your list. Well, if you work with urban youth, you're twice as likely as somebody working in that environment to experience trauma coming from your youth. And in 2011, Harvard School of Public Health said, actually, these young people don't have PTSD. Because PTSD stands for what? Post-traumatic stress, which makes sense for the soldier because the soldier leaves the battlefield. But what about young people? Right, they're going right back into it. So in 2011, Harvard School of Public Health released a completely new diagnosis called CPTSD to describe what they're seeing in the neurology and the biochemistry of young people that are exposed to unrelenting toxic stress. Because what they're saying is that what they're seeing in these young people's bodies is actually more complex than what we see in soldiers who have left the battlefield. Now, David Williams, who's also at Harvard School of Public Health, gives what for me is kind of the money equation for how do you start to then respond. And he says the biggest threat to health is the accumulation of multiple negative stressors without the resources to cope. Who does that describe? Which young person does that describe? Multiple negative stressors, no resources to cope. It describes the kid who's doing the worst, okay, in any mainstream institution. Okay? So that's your starting point. Anytime you're struggling with a young person, start with the first half of the equation. What I see happen all the time from the sensibility of care is you got a kid who's coming apart and you start shoving resources at her. You start shoving resources at him. Okay? And it doesn't change anything. And the reason why is because you haven't done the first part of the equation. You've jumped straight to resources. Okay? and resources that don't actually meet the needs of the negative stressor aren't resources at all. So the first work has to be relationships. It has to be what's going on. What happened? What do you need? Okay? And once you identify the negative stressors, then you can actually start directing young people to the resources that actually help to relieve the stressor in their life. Okay? But the problem with that is that means you actually have to get to know kids. And for some reason, so many adults that are working with kids seem loath to actually want to get to know kids. Right? The reason that the accumulation of multiple negative stressors is so dangerous is because of what it does to your allostatic load. Okay, so I want everybody leaving conversant in this term if you're not already. Now let me just start by saying that everybody in this room currently has load. Right? Everybody has an allostatic load. Right? And the reason for that is because stress is a normal part of the human condition. Right? Is there, I mean, let's be clear, like there's only one group of people on the planet that don't have stress. Dead people. Okay, so don't worry, it's guaranteed, right? You're headed for a stress-free life. Don't rush it. Stress is a natural part of the human condition, okay? And stress is actually good for your body. So under normal conditions, this is what stress looks like when we map it in your body. Okay? So I'll give you an example from my life. The first time I tried to ask my wife out. Highly stressful event. Okay? Folks joke with my wife all the time. They're like, don't you ever, worry because he travels all over the world, he's staying in hotels, he's meeting all these single people? And she goes, no. I said, well, why not? She says, because he has no game. Right? So it's completely true. So my no-game ass is literally sitting over in a corner saying to myself things like, your mom says you're handsome, your mom says you're handsome, your mom says you're handsome. And I'm going across the room to go talk to this amazing, beautiful woman, and I'm not going to tell you what I said because it's not important. I'll tell you what she said, no, but I'll take yours. So I give her my number, okay? And as I'm going across the room, okay, to try and talk to her, what's going on inside my chest? Why are you nodding and laughing at me right now? This is not appropriate. What's going on inside my chest? Right, it's pounding, right? And that is what the medical field refers to as a physiological response over time. Activity in your body, that's the uptick. Okay? Is this rushing through your body, right, of all these chemicals and enzymes to allow you to deal with the stress event, right? The one that you'll be the most familiar with is adrenaline. The one that you should be the most familiar with is cortisol. Because the medical field has been able to directly link the overproduction of cortisol to the big four unnatural killers in our society. Type 2 diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, also known as stroke, and cancer. And what's important in that research is the word unnatural. Those four things do not naturally occur in the human population. They are caused by unnatural conditions, thus the name of the film series from PBS, Unnatural Causes. Toxic stress, unrelenting toxic stress. The overproduction of cortisol in the body is not natural. And yet, it's become normed for so many young people in our society. But that's not what we're talking about right now. We're talking about a normal stress event where my body produced adrenaline, cortisol, and all these other chemicals to allow me to deal with the event. Okay? And then, right, the exchange happens, and I go and I start walking away. And then what happens inside my body? Slowly, right? Not back to normal, right? But what the medical field refers to as a recovery period. A slow, steady decline back to normal levels in my body. That is a normal stress event. That is actually good for your body. That is not what we're talking about. This is what we're talking about. Toxic stress. And when we map toxic stress events in the body, the graph looks totally different. And so I joke with high school teachers all the time because this graph is kind of like this for a high school kid. First period, second period, third period, fourth period, fifth period. And then I joke with principals and superintendents all the time because for teachers it's kind of like this. First period, second period, third period, fourth period. Now, This graph period, okay, where you see it bracketed, is the same time period as this graph period. And what do you notice about the difference in the slope between this graph and that graph? It's steeper. On which side? Both. And that's what kills you. It is a radical influx of chemicals in your body with no recovery period because you're literally bouncing stressor to stressor to stressor, thus the term repeated hits. This is what it looks like when you accumulate multiple stressors in your body. You're constantly getting hit, right? And your body's biorhythms are all over the place. And eventually, right, that can lead to this, what the medical field refers to as a lack of adaptation. Okay, these little deltas that you see all over the, what does that for my science and math people mean? Change, right? And so literally we're getting these waggles in the biorhythm. The biorhythms aren't even as clean anymore. Eventually, hey, that can become this kid, okay? This is your hypervigilant kid. This is a kid who's walking through the hallway and gets bumped and is immediately ready to fight, right? The kid who just can't have anybody in his or her space, right? That's what's actually going on in their body. They are on high alert, fully stimulated, right? Because of the unrelenting stressors in their life. They're literally in survival mode. And ultimately, you stay there long enough, right? And you begin to see this child. And this is the child that can literally look at violence and be deadpan. Because it's not that they don't care. It's that they're literally exhausted. They can't even muster a response anymore because they're just so done. Okay? This is what's happening inside kids' bodies. Right? And if, as educators, we can begin to learn to read the outward signs of these things, right? Then we can, in any of these moments, right, with fairly simple interventions, we can begin to create this, right? The de-escalation of that hypervigilance, of that trauma, toxic stress experience. The reason this is so deadly, okay, is because of what's actually happening inside their bodies. Arlene Geronimus has referred to this as weathering. Okay? Now, Arlene is at University of Michigan Ann Arbor School of Public Health, and her work on stress completely changed the conversation in the field. And there's, she does like high-end regressions and all this sort of, hyper science that I don't pretend to understand. But this issue of Miller McCune has a great summary of about 20 years of her work. Okay? And what I love about Arlene's work is that she is one of the first researchers to stop isolating stressors. So for a long time, the research in stress and toxic stress was looking at, well, how does racism affect the body? Or how does poverty affect the body? Or how does patriarchy affect the body? And what Arlene said is, well, that's all well and good in a lab, but in real life, you're getting hit from multiple different stressors all the time. And so what I want to understand, this is Arlene, what I want to understand is what does it look like when you have an intersection of multiple negative stressors, right? Unrelenting stressors. And so she did longitudinal studies of the lives of poor black women. So she caught 3 mega social stressors: race, class, gender. Right? And what she found completely changed the conversation in the field. Because what she found is these women who were biologically 40 years old, okay, inside their bodies had the bodies of 65-year-old women. They had literally aged over 2 decades internally, right? Externally, right, they're affectually holding the body of a 40-year-old. So we see them as a 40-year-old, but internally, they're literally weathering. Their bodies are literally, right, deteriorating because of how stress affects the body systems. So at this point, people are like, I gave up a Saturday for this, right? But this is a trauma conference, so y'all already knew. That's why, if you want to exit now for your trauma counseling, you can. My mother is 87 years old, and she has recently discovered email, which means that I get updates on Jesus all the time. I'm informed when he's risen, and then when he's dead, and then when there's 2 sets of footprints in the sand, and then there's only one, and... So a few years back, I did this talk at Harvard. It was me and Arnie Duncan, and Arnie Duncan went first, and then I went on and explained why everything he said was wrong. And Harvard made a big deal of it, and they put it on their YouTube channel. And so one of my older brothers gets hold of the YouTube link, and he emails it to my mom. And my mom calls me up and says, hey, son, your brother just sent me your Harvard talk. I'm going to go on YouTube, and I'm going to watch it, and then I'm going to call you back and let you know what I think. All right, cool, Ma. So about 90 minutes later, my mom calls me back. I said, what'd you think, Ma? She says, I think you curse too much. Now, the good thing about my mom is she does not text message. And if you don't know what that means, don't worry about it. It's not actually important. Hey, what is important is that the medical field is actually clear about the fact that we're not screwed at all. And what the medical field has found is that the biggest protective factor in the lives of young people experiencing toxic stress is hope. The medical field is literally now measuring hope. Now, I'm an English teacher, so I like the word hope because if you look it up in a dictionary, you'll find that it's both a noun and a verb. It's a dynamic word. It's both a thing and an action. And as I said, the research community has become increasingly interested in hope. Hey, some of my favorite work comes from psychology, the work of Charles Schneider. He developed something called the Children's Hope Scale. Hey, we literally use the Children's Hope Scale in our high school classroom. Two of my co-teachers are sitting right here. We did the first study in the nation, longitudinal study of hope in the classroom, looking at what actually happens to children's hope levels when they're exposed to a culturally and community responsive ethnic studies framework curriculum. Okay? And my favorite definition of hope actually comes from a faculty member here at UC Berkeley. In the School of Public Health. His name is Lynn Syme. Right? And Lynn defines hope as a sense of control of destiny. You know, I don't know why y'all got into this work, but that's why I got into this work. Because I wanted young people in my community to have a greater sense of control over their own destiny. And what I found in doing this research is that I'm actually not a teacher at all. That I'm a hope dealer. And I'm a hope dealer battling dope dealers. And when I say dope dealers, I'm not talking about the cat standing on a corner pushing nickel bags. Okay? I'm talking about the hope dealers like Pearson and Hope Mifflin and testing companies that teach our young people to hate themselves for the color of their skin and the texture of their hair and the color of their eyes and the language they speak and the community they come from and who their ancestors are. That's dope. And you push that dope into a young person's veins long enough and they end up on the corner buying nickel and dime bags to begin to deal with the pain that dope pushed into their system is putting on them. There's only one way a young person gets their finger on a trigger and points it at somebody that looks just like them and cocks the hammer back. Only one way. And that's if they hate themselves. Okay? And that is a learned behavior. We are teaching our children to hate themselves. And that is dope. And the antidote to that dope is hope. And the reason that the medical field finds that hope is so powerful as an agent, as an inoculation to toxic stress, okay? The agent of that, the creation of that, is directly linked to the number of caring adults that a young person can name in their life. That is causal. Caring adults cause hope in young people's life. And what they find in the research, no outliers, what they find in the research, study after study after study, is the more caring adults a young person can actually name, the higher their hope levels. And they find that the higher their hope levels, the more likely that young person effectively navigates toxic stress. And the more that I've done this research, the more that I've realized that I'm not actually onto anything new. That I'm simply upholding the principles of our ancestors that we've gotten so far away from, as schools have become all about sanitizing, okay, the experience. Safety, okay? False narration of safety. Right? Never allowing young people to bring their woundedness in. No space for that in our academic rigor. Now, I told y'all in the beginning that I come from the Opata people, which then connects me to the Mexicayo and the Mayan. Okay? And the Mayan people had one core principle. They taught all their children called In Lakesh, and the idea of In Lakesh became, at least for a brief moment, right? an increasing part of the educational dialogue, particularly in the progressive education community, because of the work of the Race Studies program in Tucson Unified. And those folks taught me so much, right, about my own ancestry and my own history. And Inlakesh. Now, Inlakesh, for those of you not familiar with it, okay, is essentially the story of the smoking mirror. It is the idea that we would teach all our children that every single living being that you come across is a smoking mirror. That is not the question. The question is whether or not you can muster the courage, character, and commitment to clear the smoke away. Because if you do, what will you see? You will see yourself. And ultimately, that's the challenge for us as educators. Can we muster the courage, character, and commitment to clear the smoke away, to find ourselves in these young people? And the truth is the more wounded the child, the more smoke. Because the more wounded the child, the more fire. Right? And the truth is that schools resent the wounded child. They resent the most wounded child the most, because the most wounded child tells the most truth. As my maestro Jerry Theo reminded me, the most wounded child tells the most truth. They can't cover it up anymore. And that insults us. It makes us so terribly uncomfortable to understand that we live in a nation state that literally punishes our children. We live in a nation state that has built a crumbling foundation whereby the people that need the most get the least, and the people that need the least get the most. We have built a nation state that, with its bookends, okay, its children and its elderly are throwaways. And we hyper-invest in the most physically able, the middle group, us. Okay? That is a nation state whose center cannot hold. That empire is guaranteed to crumble when you least invest in your children and your elderly. You're doomed. And that is the path that we're on right now. That is the work that we're trying to rectify. That's why the work you do every day with children matters so much, because it's interruptive, okay, of a pathway to destruction for this nation state. Right? We've got to hyper-invest in children. And that hyper-investment has to be in the children that are the most wounded and vulnerable. And that is the teachings of the ancestors. And you may be thinking, but I don't come from the Mayan people, and I don't come, and as a Rasa person, I would argue with you about that, as we believe that we're all cosmic people from the stars, but that's, again, for another conference. Okay? But what I would say to you is that whoever your people are, wherever you track back your ancestry to, I guarantee you that you have the teaching of Inlakesh. This is not a Mayan principle. This is a civilized principle. This is a human-based principle. Okay? And to get back to the teachings of your ancestors is the beginning of you being able to see yourselves in the children that you serve. Now, the way we try to do it in our community is by building what we refer to as critical hope. Okay? And we believe that there are 3 pillars to critical hope. It's like a trifecta. And a trifecta, for those of you that are betting people, will understand that a trifecta is a 3-part bet, right? And you don't win the bet unless you hit on all 3. Okay, so if you're just doing 2 of these things, you won't land in critical hope. The first of these is what we call material hope. This is the understanding that first and foremost, okay, just be badass at what you do. However it is that you serve. Okay? Be the dopest ever counselor, the dopest ever teacher, the dopest ever youth leader, the dopest ever principal, the dopest ever. And that is a major material resource in communities where so many of the institutions, okay, are being staffed by people who aren't really all that dope. Okay? So the second, right, component of this is an understanding that just being dope won't be enough. You're going to have to supplement your dopeness with real material resources. You're going to have to pay attention. Who's the child that shows up in the same clothes every single day? Who's the child that shows up and is clearly not showering or bathing? Who's the child that shows up and is always hungry? Who is that child? And how do you provide real material resources to that child? Come out your North Face coat. You can always go back to the outlet. We have one right over here. Okay? Pay attention to the child who's coming every day in this torrential rain that we've got in a windbreaker, soaked to the core. Right? And we act as if that's not even happening. I watch teachers drive out of parking lots, watching kids get rained on, not even thinking to stop and offer a ride or to hand out your umbrella. You're in a car, right? You're good. You can get a little wet getting from your car to your house, and then you go to CVS and get an umbrella for 99 cents. Right? That literal material resourcing of children is what closes the gap between their most pressing needs and what it is that we actually offer them inside of our institutions. But we've known this since 1943. Okay? So if you're in a school that claims to be research-based and data-driven and they don't talk about Maslow, you can just go ahead and say you can't possibly be research-based or data-driven because there is nothing being used in schools that has the research base of Maslow. 6+ decades, study after study after study, has affirmed that indeed Maslow is onto something. That if a child shows up hungry, guess what? They're not going to be able to fully engage. Okay? If a child shows up feeling unsafe, and when I talk about safety, I'm not just talking about physical safety. I'm talking about cultural safety. I'm talking about linguistic safety. I'm talking about identity safety. Right? If a child does not feel safe being who they really are, being who their ancestors raised them to be, okay, then they are not going to be able to fully engage in any lesson that we provide them. Now, what's interesting about Maslow is how the Western institution basically ignored Maslow, the beginning of Maslow's work. So if you study Maslow at the beginning of his work, what you will find is Maslow acknowledged that he actually appropriated this. Okay? Maslow appropriated this from indigenous people, specifically the Blackfoot Nation. Okay? Maslow himself acknowledges this. He went to the Blackfoot Nation because he was particularly intrigued with what was happening in the Blackfoot Nation. Maslow gets drawn into this because Maslow's family was the survivors of the Jewish Holocaust. And he's particularly interested in the fact that how do people do that? How do people make it through conditions like that? And then he finds himself in the U.S. and he's like, well, the U.S. has experienced 2 genocides. And is there any evidence inside of these genocides of people who are finding a way to thrive despite the constant attack on their humanity? And he comes across the Blackfoot Nation. And so he goes and he becomes a student, right, of the Blackfoot Nation and the Blackfoot people. And the Blackfoot people teach him, okay, but they teach him what they call the breath of life. And the breath of life is basically this pyramid, but it's inverted. So the last thing they talk about is food, clothing, shelter, safety. Now, why would that be? Why would the last thing that an autonomous indigenous community talks about is we got to make sure to feed, clothe, and shelter our children? Because duh, right? Do we really need to talk about that? We really need to talk about having a sense of love and belonging for our own children. We really need to talk about teaching our children our language and our traditions so that they love themselves and their people. And Maslow says, yeah, in this nation, we actually do. And so he inverts the paradigm and says that we are living in a world upside down. Eduardo Galeano wrote, okay, upside down. We're living in a world where those who need the least get the most, and those who need the most get the least. That's upside down. And so we actually have to say this. And he says, as long as we have to say this, we will be an unhealthy society. We will know that we are right side up when this pyramid that I'm presenting is inverted. Now, when you hear people talk about Maslow's work, they conveniently ignore the fact that Maslow got that knowledge from indigenous people in this land, okay? And that Maslow said, actually, this isn't the pathway to health and wellness. This is the pathway to inverting us toward health and wellness because we're so far from health and wellness, right? So understand, right, that there's always a clinical side that has some value, and there's a cultural side that has some value, and it's the mixing of those medicines, okay, that really begins to create powerful healing for young people. Now, if we get the material hope side right, okay, then the question is can we stay self-reflective? Can we do what Cornel West calls, can we have what Cornel West calls a Socratic sensibility? Can we continually ask, why does it have to be this way? Can we understand that the children's pain that we serve is our pain? Now, the way we try to do this is by understanding the difference between being liked and being loved in our community. And what we find is so many people that are serving in our community are outsiders to our community. And when you're an outsider, you tend to be like Switzerland. You just keep it cool with everybody, right? You want to be conflict averse, right? And you aim to be liked. No one that has profoundly transformed your life is someone that you would describe as somebody that you like. Okay? The people that have transformed your life are the people that loved you. And the problem with the conversation of love in this nation state is that it's profoundly Pollyannish. It's all based on the Notebook. Everything just ends up okay in the end. Right? And we developed this sensibility, this Hollywood-esque sensibility about love in this society, hey, that love is the absence of conflict. And if suddenly I find myself in conflict, this must not be love. Okay? Love is not the absence of conflict. Love is the presence of conflict with the courage, character, and commitment to find your way through. Okay? That's love. And I'll prove it to you. How many of you have ever had a personal relationship go bad? Isn't this a trauma conference? There should be 100% hands up. I did this talk in Texas. You can imagine how I go over in Texas. But it's okay because I was in Austin, which isn't really Texas. It was all of Austin unified. It was like 2,000 teachers. And I asked that question. 1,999 people raised their hand. One person lied. And there was mics set up down the rows for the Q&A. And this one woman who's sitting right on the aisle, right next to the mic, grabs the mic and goes, "Yeah, and he's right there." That was precisely my reaction. I was like, go ahead. This will be way more interesting than anything I have to say. Y'all want to see some trauma? Here it comes. So I'm talking about the one where you got your heart stomped out. The one that made you fundamentally doubt love. That one. After you got crushed, who paid for your pain? Oh, now we got a bunch of silent folks in here. Right? Y'all just held your trauma. You didn't take it out on anyone. Bullshit. Okay? The next one. We even have a name for it in our society. It's called the rebound. Right? Those closest to you, right, caught some of that lateral trauma because the natural human instinct is to protect yourself. And when you're wounded, right, you become particularly vigilant about protecting yourself. And so when you went back into that next relationship, you didn't go back wide open. You went back with an arm up. Okay? And if you are currently in a loving and caring relationship, it's because that person received your arm not as an attack or an affront, okay, but as the work that needed to be done. And they said, "That's all right. That's not me. I understand. Okay? And I know you're bringing some baggage with you, and we can unpack that one piece at a time." And then 6 months later, they said, "By the way, I have some baggage too. Can we get to mine now?" Love's not the absence of conflict. Love is the presence of conflict. And if we're really going to love these babies, well, there's going to be some conflict. There's going to be some funk. Okay? And can we stay true in that moment? Can we actually hear Pac's, when you think what was so profound to me about Tupac, is he literally modified the word love. He found the word love incomplete, insufficient. And so he adds the modifier unconditional. Unconditional love, okay, is the kind of love that pushes you through conflict to healing. Okay? Young people are going to bring the hurt. And as they say, hurt people hurt people. Okay? And the challenge for us as educators and youth workers is, can we receive that weight that they're bringing, okay, time and time again, and show up the next day and put our heart back on our chest? Or are we going to cover up and no longer be able to receive their woundedness? And that is why this work is so damn hard. And that is what I find most troubling about the way in which we train youth workers and educators, is that we're dishonest about just how hard this work is going to be. And that, y'all, is why teachers drink. Now, I end with audacious hope, because if you're going to do this in this way, you've got to be audacious. And that's one of the first things I see taken from young educators and youth workers, is the belief that they can change the world, is the belief that they can develop these kinds of deep, meaningful, impactful relationships with young people. Don't ever let them take your audacity. And for those OGs that are in the room, our ability to continue to, not that I'm an OG, but our ability as veterans, as people who have been doing this for a long time, to model audacity for early career folks, is hugely important, so that they come in and they see a model of somebody who's been doing it for 2 or 3 decades, and you're still killing it in that way, right? And you got a little more polish to you, right? But you still believe fundamentally in what brought you into this work. Continually revisit that and spark and endorse that in the folks that are coming into this work. And the way we try to do this is by thinking about controlling the space where we have some control. What I've laid out to this point is a meta-ecosystem that is often quite toxic to the lives of young people. And then they bring that toxicity in their bodies to us. Right? But no master gardener blames the seed for not growing. The master gardener understands that the seed doesn't grow in the soil. It's because I didn't get the soil right. So dig where you stand. Dig where you stand. And if those seeds aren't growing in that soil, then you got to change what you're doing to the soil. And the best description I've heard of this actually comes from a medical doctor, a woman named Camera Jones, black woman who's an MD on the teaching faculty at Columbia. She wrote an article for a medical journal called The Gardener's Tale, and she tells a story about her and her husband had just bought a house in New York, and she's walking up the steps of the house, and she gets to the top of the stairs, and there's a window to the right, and she looks to the right, and underneath the window, she sees a flower box. And she turns to her husband, she says, that should be our first project, because that's going to be the first thing that people see when they come to visit us. And her husband, like any smart partner, says back, yes, dear. Okay? Brilliant idea. And so that weekend they go to the gardening store and they buy a bag of soil and a packet of flower seeds. And she comes back and she's standing at the top of the stairs and she's leaning in to pour the soil into the flower box. And as she leans in, she realizes there's a partition splitting it in half. And on one side there's already soil. And so she takes the fresh soil and she puts it in on the empty side. And then she takes the packet of flower seeds and she splits it in half, and she needs half of the seeds into the side with the fresh soil and half of the seeds into the side with the soil that was already there. And she says over the next several weeks and months, she paid special attention to make sure both sides got plenty of water and plenty of light. And she says what happened next is the most important medical discovery of her career. Because on the side with the fresh soil, all the seeds grew, full height, vibrant colors, and they made space for each other in the box. But on the side with the soil that was already there, she realized that soil was old, and it was devoid of some key nutrients, and it was rocky. And on that side, only a few of the seeds grew, and they only grew to middling height. And they crowded each other in the box for the few resources that were available. And she says, what I realized in that moment is how much place matters. That's how much you matter. When you transform the place, wherever that is, wherever you do that work, when you transform that place, it creates the space for young people to find their way up through the concrete. Now, I've been at this 24 years in my community, and I have never had a perfect year. I have never had a perfect semester. I have never had a perfect marking period. I have never had a perfect month. I have never had a perfect week. I have never had a perfect day, and I have never had a perfect class period, ever in 24 years. But I wake up every day expecting to, knowing that I won't. In order to do that, for a full arc of your life's work, you've got to be audacious. Never, ever let them take your audacity from you. There are a few people who have modeled this as profoundly as this woman in their lives. And so I end with one of our ancestors and one of my best teachers, Maya Angelou. And I have next to Maya a colleague of mine, Sean Ginwright, wrote a book called Black Youth Rising, and I have that book next to her picture, not so much because of the title, but because of the subtitle, where Sean uses the words radical healing. And the conditions that we're talking about with the children that need us the most are radical conditions. and we keep trying to piecemeal a response. Radical conditions demand a radical response. Teachers working in radicalized environments of inequity and inequality, hey, can't just be healers. You got to be radical healers. And there are a few radical healers that articulate the way I think about critical hope in the way that Maya Angelou does in this interview. So I'm going to play her as a way to bring us home.
Was doing with the movie Poetic Justice, and that would I come out to Los Angeles and do Kenya. I walked out of my trailer that morning, and there was one young man cursing like you could see the blue come out of his mouth. And then he and another fellow, they were in each other's throat. They had each other's throat. So I went up to one young man, and I said, excuse me, may I speak to you? He said, I wouldn't give, I said, I understand that. But may I speak to you for a minute? He said, if these moves, I said, I've heard that before. But do you know how important you are? Do you know that our people slept, lay spoon fashion in the filthy hatches of slave ships, in their own and in each other's excrement and urine and menstrual flow, so that you could live 200 years later? Do you know that? Do you know that our people stood on auction blocks so that you could live? He said, I said, no, but I just want to, when's the last time anyone told you how important you are? And he started the tears started to come out. I had no Kleenex or anything, so I just wiped his face with my hands and talked to him. And Miss Janet Jackson came. She said, Dr. Angelo, I don't believe you actually talked to Tupac Shakur. So I didn't know Tupac Shakur. I didn't know Six Pack. I had never heard the name. Because in my life and my age group, you understand, I didn't know that. Tupac's mother wrote me a letter. She said her son had called her right after I had spoken to him. And she wanted to thank me. She said, you may have saved his life. And I thank you, Dr. Angelo.
In that one story, she painted a more human picture of him than the entire media did during his career, you know. People were afraid of Tupac. The media made him like he was this scary thing. And she talked about him like he was a young man in a confusing and difficult situation. And that's kind of what I like about Dr. Angelo. Because I know I'm not perfect and whatever, but it's something that she can look at me and she can kind of put the picture together. She knows I'm just a dude trying to figure it out.
Each of us has a chance to be somebody. And it's my delight that you would ask for me so that I could have the pleasure, the joy, the thrill of talking to you so that I can be somebody.
So for me, that's master pedagogy. The master pedagogue never resents the mess because they know the meaning is inside the mess. And the weak pedagogue wants it to be clean, sanitized. And that guarantees that the young person who's bringing some mess has no place in that space. Now, the beauty of this story for me is the way in which we can choose to interpret it. So, Maya Angelou, where does this happen, this engagement with Pac? Where does it happen? Where was she? A movie set, okay? So she's literally on a movie set. She comes out of her trailer, Nobel Peace Prize nominee in literature, grandmother, national treasure, walks out of her trailer and sees who about to fight? No, she can't see Tupac. She doesn't even know who Six Pack is. Okay, so she does not see Tupac. So that's the first thing that happens. It's like, of course, like if you see Tupac, shit, get in there. Like, it's Tupac. You got to save him. Right? She doesn't see Tupac. She doesn't even know who Tupac is. Who does she see about to fight? No. Dave Chappelle's not there. Someone that was hurting. No way. No way. A National Treasure Nobel Peace Prize nominee grandmother runs off her movie set to intervene in somebody's life who's hurting. Right? That's when you call security, when it's somebody who's hurting. Right? But who does she really see, my brother? Her child. She sees her son. She sees herself. And if you have children, right, you know, if you saw your son or daughter about to get in one, there would be no fucking protocol that you go through, right? There's not like, okay, wait, what do I do in that? Boom, right? You're there. Your life is inconsequential in that moment because it's your child. And then you figure it out, right, in the moment. No playbook, no script, right? All your training out the door, right? Because you're going from here. She doesn't see Tupac. She doesn't see two black boys, right? She sees herself. She sees her child. That's the lesson for us, right? Can we see these children as our children? Because then all of, right, the protocols drop off. And the question becomes about what do you need, right, in this moment? Now, I see teachers try to make that first move all the time, right? Because that's why you signed up. And then you get in there. So now you made the first move. It's like, oh my goodness, I got to get in there. I love this kid. And now I'm in there, right? And you get in front of the kid. And what happens when Maya gets there? So she intervenes. And what is Tupac's reaction? His first reaction is what? He curses her out. Okay, A, don't do that. That's just all around bad karma to curse out a grandma, okay? But he curses her out. What's her reaction when... It's all right, I heard that before. You got any more bricks you need me to put in my backpack? I got room. Come on, my heart's full. But I see teachers and youth workers engage with young people all the time who are hurting, and they blast that hurt at us. And then our response is, well, fine then. If you don't want my help, you come back when you're ready to be helped. Okay? Because I don't deserve that. Right? Because it's about us. Instead of actually about the child. Because if it's about the child, it's like, oh, is that what you need to dump right now? Come on, dump. Right? And she comes back at him and says, right, I heard all that before. But do you understand how important you are? What's his second response? He curses again. Oh, yeah, I heard that too. Right? But do you understand what our people have been through so that you can be here? Do you understand how precious you are? Do you understand that you have sacred purpose? And then what happens? Then he starts leaving. Now she's through. Right? She's into here. And because Maya finds the courage, character, and commitment to do that, okay, circa 1991, so this happens on the movie set of Poetic Justice. Okay, because she intervenes in his life, according to Tupac's own mother, that decision in that moment saved his life. And if you study Tupac as an artist, what you will find is the 5 years that Maya bought him by doing that in that moment, between 1991 and when he is murdered in the streets of Las Vegas in 1996, that 5 years was the most productive 5-year period of his artistic career. In fact, he wrote so much in that 5 years that they couldn't publish it all. This is why Pac has album after album after album coming out after he's dead. One of the albums that was written in its entirety in those 5 years that Maya bought him was released in 2003. And the title of that album is Resurrection. And in 2009, my homie snapped this photo in Kathmandu. It is a picture of 3 brothers standing in front of one of the largest Buddhist shrines in the world. And the oldest brother in the middle is turned to his right, and he's consoling his middle brother, whose hand is on his head because he is weeping. And the baby brother on the left is watching, learning empathy. And what you might not catch about the photo is the shirt that the oldest brother is wearing. That is the album shirt from Resurrection. And that is the truth of the impact of this work. When we invest in our Tupacs, when we invest in the kids that are blowing the system up, those are the kids that are most likely to transform the system because they have the least to lose and the most to gain. And the reason that Tupac's words continue to spill down into the concrete is because he understands the concrete. And he speaks down in the concrete as somebody who came through the concrete and came back to grow more roses. And the truth is that our institutions are the most likely to throw that child away, to say that they don't fit. The very people that are the most likely to transform this society are the ones that are the least likely to find a place in our institutions. And as long as that remains, the status quo remains status quo, stable. Right? How do we understand that our greatest hope for fundamental change is the young people that make us the hardest for us to connect with them? And at the end of the day, that is the work of hope. And hope transcends borders, it transcends institutions, it transcends neighborhoods because it transcends lives. If I can help you in any way on that journey, please do not hesitate to reach out. Any of the resources that I shared here today, any of the research, the slides, anything that can be useful to you in your work as you try to do healing and hope work in your communities, please don't hesitate to reach out. This work never gets done in isolation. I have so many homies in this room that have helped us do the work in our community in East Oakland, big homies on the same level. Hey, is how the work gets done. You can't do it in isolation. That's the beauty of a space like this. Please leave today with more resources and more connections so that the young people that need us the most get what they need. Thank you.
My family comes from Oakland. My dad was part of the 60s. I totally get it. I'm a librarian. It's a predominantly very privileged profession. I'm a minority. I have a traumatic background. I'm being used as the tool to introduce this to different concepts. And like, how do you do that peer to peer when they don't listen? So that's my question.
Okay. So, do you ever work with young people that don't listen?
Yeah.
Okay. So,
yeah. Yeah. My voice doesn't travel. Yeah. So, I'm a librarian. I work with, that part. So I'm being used, my stories are being used as a way to introduce diversity in different settings. And sometimes they don't ask my permission to use my stories. And so those, like you mentioned, they're very sacred. They're very personal. And I get it's a cultural awareness that we need to talk about. But how do you navigate that from peer to peer when they don't have that cultural sensitivity? If I stated that correctly.
Yeah. So at one level, I mean, you narrated the question a little bit differently the second time, right? So if they're literally violating your sacredness, right? Then that's intolerable. So I mean, I don't want to put you in like job jeopory or anything,
right?
Not at all. But I would say you need to make that clear, right? Yeah. That my stories are not for your voyeurism, right?
This is on. This is what?
So that's the first thing, and I think that needs to be like non-negotiable, right? And then, right, what you can sort of reclaim the space by saying like I'm actually okay with sharing my story, right? But I need to have control over that, right? Yeah. And so what I need from you is for you to step back and let me, right, really drive how this happens. And when I need you, I'll let you know.
That's exactly what it is.
Okay. So that's the first piece. And my guess is that you've got some colleagues that are just like straight up like don't get it, don't want to get it, right, and are coming from either a white supremacist or a male supremacist, right, framework, right, or some right, sense of like devaluing, dehumanizing you, right?
Yeah.
So there's that group of people, and I think that in my experience, the direct approach with those people is the most effective. But then there's inevitably a group of folks, right, that actually want to get it.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And just haven't had access to really like unpack their own stuff. Okay? So I just want to deal with those folks because I think if you can move those folks, then your impact spreads.
Oh,
Okay?
yeah.
So with those folks, that takes me to the question that I was originally asking: was have you ever had a student that doesn't listen, that doesn't right, isn't tracking you? Okay.
I have. I'm a librarian, but definitely there's those kids who are just like, I'm not hearing it.
Right. Okay. So what do you do with that child?
I change my approach. Sometimes I listen to them, or I'll find a commonality, or I'll share my stories because my stories are mine, and you can receive them differently.
Right. And what I've learned over the years is the same thing that I do with young people works with grown-ups. And what I struggled with early in my career was I just had like no tolerance for grown-ups. Frankly, I just fundamentally disliked them.
Adults suck.
And I like young people, so I'll take all kinds of shit off of young people, right? And I'll be, that's cool. Like I've heard that before. Like I got that wrapped down, right?
Yeah.
Because they're young, and I'm like, that's who I signed up to serve. And then one of my big homies, I was in the gig for over a decade, and I was seen as a really successful educator. And one of my big homies pulled me to the side, and he said, "I don't believe you really care about these kids." And I was like, "You bugging with me right now? Wait, what? Like, me? Like, I care about these kids." He says, "No, I don't believe you." And I was like, "Why?" And he says, "Because if you really cared about these kids, you'd care about your colleagues." And I was like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "These kids only have you for an hour. And then they go to all those people that you don't have time for because they just don't get it." He says, "If you really care about them, you need to expand your impact." And what he literally said to me was, good teachers show up every day and kick ass in their classrooms. Great teachers show up every day, kick ass in their classrooms, and transform institutional culture. Okay? And so the transformation of institutional culture means you gotta find a way to impact some of those colleagues that are ready to receive it but aren't getting it in the way you're delivering it, right? Expand your pedagogical toolbox. And part of that is you having a mind shift, right, with how you see those folks.
And that mind shift hurts. I mean, it's a painful process.
For
it's
sure.
what I'm going through.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
So, yeah,
Right? But there is no progress without pain.
no.
Okay? And I think that, but you've got to also sort of, self-manage that because the goal isn't to drive yourself into the ground so you can help these people who quote unquote don't get it, right? So I think but when you start seeing your impact with grown-ups, okay, I think one, it's super affirming for you, right? And then what you'll also see is your impact grows exponentially because now all the youth that you touch, you're impacting, and all the youth that adult is getting contact with, right? That's how we grow our impact exponentially, is can we help develop other educators that can do this, right? The third piece that I would say, just as a kind of walk away for you, is start recruiting other folks like yourself that you don't have to do the translation. So be a gatekeeper, hold the librarian door open, okay? And start bringing in 20-year-olds, right, that say, you're gonna be a librarian just like me.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And then there's less translation that's necessary because they're actually coming from communities like we come from.
Yeah. Thank you.
Some more
Thank you.
questions from the audience. We have so many excellent questions. Number one, how can we address trauma as educators, scholars, etc., and not reproduce the tendency of our institutions to pathologize and overly psychologize trauma?
Yeah, I think that one of my biggest fears about this talk and this paper is that, right? That people then see youth as damaged, right? Although they have trauma, and I think it's what I opened with, okay, is that the trauma is real, and so is the resilience. So do you start from a framework of asset? Do you start from a framework of cultural strength? Do you understand that every child that comes to you is a glass half full, right? And this is, I think, why young people are so drawn to Tupac's work, because he says, I see you, right? I see your damaged petals. And what the damaged petals indicate to me is your resiliency. They indicate your willingness and your drive to reach the sun, okay? And so what is read as a damaged petal actually becomes, right, evidence of your capacity, okay? And so if we understand trauma in that way, right, you have to understand that trauma is happening, that young people are literally being wounded by this society. That's real. But the fact that they still come anyway, if they can literally travel through that war zone that was on that map to get to your space, how can you not engage them? If they will go through all that just to get to the space, how can we possibly say that that kid is disengaged? Right? So that's some of you may be familiar with the work of Carol Dweck at Stanford, who has suddenly become like all the rage in schools, right? Mindset, mindset, mindset. And if you listen to Carol's most recent speeches, she's so pissed because of how schools are using her work. Because what they've done is they've said, oh yeah, it's all about mindset. And so whose mindsets are they trying to change? The kids. It's like, yeah, if the kids just had the right mindset, they'd be just doing so much better. So Carol's now back on the lecture circuit like, no, assholes, that is not what I said. You're totally misusing my research. What I said is mindset, yes. And what I'm telling you is that the children's mindset reflect the adult mindset. So if you want to change the children's mindset, you got to change the adult mindset, right? And I think that's would be my answer to the question, is that if it gets misread, right, in a debilitating way, that's an adult issue. That we choose how we see these kids. And if we see them for their beauty and their strength and their ancestors and their sacredness, and we treat that interaction as sacred, okay, do you use ceremony in your work? Or do kids just walk into your classroom? Do they just walk into your space? Because if you see this work as sacred, then it must have ceremony. But if you don't have ceremony, then it's transactional. And once it's transactional, then it's institutionalized. And once it's institutionalized, then when kids don't get it, okay, then you blame the kid. But when it's sacred, and you see the child as sacred, when they don't get it, it's because you're not delivering on the sacredness of the relationship.
A number of people here have asked about burnout, especially in the context of the election, and what are the mechanisms, processes, strategies?
What election?
Apparently there was an election.
Oh, okay.
Burnout prevention, self-care, doing this very difficult and important work.
Look, I just had dinner with Cam the other night. We were talking about this. I don't know. I kind of feel like I'm like the worst dude to ask about self-care. And it's not because like I don't self-care. Like I'm super healthy. You know, I'm super healthy and I'm super happy. And I don't, because I don't think about self-care. I mean, I'm not trying to be dismissive, but like I don't know. I don't feel like I'm good at answering this question, so I'm going to give you what is likely an unsatisfactory answer. Okay. I believe that this work is self-care. That when you do it in this way, right? And perhaps it's because it's not work to me. Like I don't have a job. People ask me all the time, like, what do you do? And I don't even know how to answer that question. Because I know what they're looking for, right? They're looking for, what's your title? You know? And I've never thought about this work in that way. And this is my sacred purpose. I am fulfilling my sacred purpose. And I don't construct my life in the way in which I think many Western ideologies construct my life, where I have these like, you know, quote unquote, like 8 to 5 boundaries or, you know, whatever. And I'm not saying those are bad. I'm saying like that you got to reconcile those for yourself. And what I can say is that I've never felt the need, right, to have those boundaries because I've always believed that my community will protect me. And every time I've gotten in like funky places, the children and families that I serve make me take a break. And they bring me food. And they heal me. And they say, come back when you're ready, but we got you right now. And that's what my parents taught me. You know, I was raised the youngest of 7 kids. We didn't have shit. And my parents never complained because they chose to have 7 kids. They never complained about we never getting new clothes because we got the new clothes. They never complained about missing meals because they had to feed us and there wasn't enough to go around. They never complained because it was healing. It was food to them. Okay? And I don't want to like overly romanticize, you know, like I don't think you need to martyr yourself. That's not what I'm saying. Right? But I'm saying if you feel a misalignment between your service and your personal life, right, then you got to really think about your service. Okay? Because for me, like that distinction is blurred. My service is my personal life. My personal life is my service. Because I know I have twin boys that are 4 years old on the 3400 block of East Oakland. They've already watched my neighbor get shot in the middle of the street. When they were 2 years old, they seen somebody get shot right in front of my house. And I know that when they're 16 and 17 years old, they're not going to hear papi. They're not going to hear me in the way they hear me now. And I'm going to need another 16-year-old or a 22-year-old or a 25-year-old who's coming up on my block right now. I'm going to need them to save my son's life. Okay? I'm going to need that kid that nobody else wants to invest in. I'm going to need that kid on an AC transit bus one time when somebody's trying to fuck with my son and it's got heat in their back pocket. And I'm like, nah, you don't fuck with those two, not those two, because those are Jeff's boys. Right? And so I understand, right, that the service is literally about my whole family, all my relations, all my community. Right? And right now we're in a place, speaking to the election, right, where we all probably gonna do a little more, just because of how fucked up it is right now, right? And we either resent that burden, or we embrace it as our sacred purpose and an opportunity. Right? Now, I'll give you one more piece of advice, because I get asked that question all the time, and I was at Harvard one time. Okay, and they had used this piece that I had written for their anchor piece in their teacher ed program. And so I was asked to come and do like the final lecture for all of their teacher ed students. And I come and I do this talk, and this teacher, 20-something, you know, white kid at Harvard raises his hand. He says, Jeff, I want to do everything. I want to be that teacher that you described. But I also want balance in my life. And I'm like, dude, you're 23 at Harvard and you're thinking about balance? Okay, so I digress. And I said, what I said right now, I said, look, I'm going to give you an answer. It's going to be unsatisfactory. And then on the flight home, I'm going to write you a letter. And I'm going to tell you what I really think. And so I gave him basically the answer I just gave. And then I wrote a letter, which has since been published in the Journal of, or the Association of Raza Educators, called Note to Educators Seeking Balance in Their Life. Oh, no, I think it's an open letter to educators seeking balance in their life. And I gave a fairly unsatisfactory response in that letter as well. And so I went to one of my homies, this brother named Danny Cornejo, and we worked together for many years. And I said, Danny, I'm really struggling with this question I keep getting about balance. And Danny says, give me your phone. And I'm like, okay. So I take out my phone, right? And he says, open up your calendar. And so I open up my iCal. Right? And if you look at my iCal, it's like 9 different calendars with 9 different colors and meetings bleeding across meetings, and there's no breakfast, lunch, or dinner scheduled in any there, right? And he shows me this, and he goes, you don't have balance in your life. He's like, that's why you can't answer the question, because it's the wrong question. And I'm like, Danny, you're not helping me. And he says, no. He says, you don't have balance. You have harmony. That was my response precisely. Right? I was like, oh. And I think it's this Western idea that I have to balance out my life, that everything has to fit neatly on my calendar. Okay? And I don't have that for sure. but I have tremendous harmony in my life, right? And I think it's when you have harmony, that's where joy comes from. That's where audacity comes from, right? So are you harmonized with your sacred purpose in the world, right? And then when you do, your calendar begins to take care of itself.